The nursery smelled like boiled rice and lavender hand soap, like the kind of clean that tried to keep grief at bay. It was 2 in the morning and the house was asleep, except for the soft, irregular noises of an infant figuring out how to be alive. Ronnie's breaths were small and quick against my chest, his cheek warm and slick with the small salt of milk. I had been doing this for months in the margins of my life, nights mostly, feeding other people's babies, rocking them until they stopped shaking from hunger and began to sleep. I thought I knew the shape of need, the particular humility of it. I thought I had measured out the contours of my own capacity. Then the doorway filled with him. Andrew's silhouette was a dark cut against the corridor light, the heavy scent of his cologne less dominant than the sharpness of fear. He was on his knees on the nursery rug, palms flat on either side of the doorway, as if the floor were the only thing steady enough to hold him. He looked like someone who had discovered a map upside down. Every direction he reached was wrong. For a second, he was only presence, too big for the room, too big for his own grief. Then his voice came out small, something like breaking glass. Please. What he was asking me to do, wasn't the scandal everyone would whisper about. It was a practical, terrified request. Ronnie wouldn't take a bottle. The pediatrician had said so in that even, too calm way doctors use when they are running calculations in the back of their heads. Weight is marginal. If he continues like this, we need to intervene. Andrew had been on the brink for days. He had called everyone he could think of, and every answer had been a polite, professional no, a referral, an invoice. That night, he had come to the nursery himself because he could no longer stand the thought of his son failing to thrive while appointments and policies argued. I remember the exact way his throat moved when he swallowed before speaking again. If there's anything you can do, for him, for Ronnie. There is always a second between need and action where people weigh shame, where they count their options in the silence. I had a history with those silences. Lily's nursery, back when she was my daughter, had been emptied in a way that felt both abrupt and interminable. The absence of her small clothes, the outline of where her cot had been, those things had taught me the arithmetic of grief. What is subtracted doesn't always return, but you can sometimes find ways to allocate what remains. I had a supply left. I had learned to lactate for needing. My body remembered a rhythm that my heart still refused to forget. I did not make a show of it. I asked 2 simple questions because that's how I kept myself honest and because the child on my chest deserved more than my impulses. Have you spoken to the pediatrician? I asked. The man bowed in the doorway. Have you tried donor milk?
Andrew's fingers curled into the rug. Yes. They said donor milk is an option, but there are tests, waiting lists. He won't take a bottle. He's losing weight, and He stopped, swallowed again. I don't have anyone else. Is he being tube-fed? I asked. I did not want to imagine that. He wasn't, not yet. Just fragile, faltering. No. Okay. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone older than me, practical, sharp. I felt the baby's small hands fumble at my collar. If you want me to try, I'll try, but there are things we need to agree on, for Ronnie's safety. Consent, even in situations where flesh presses against flesh in the most basic acts of survival, must be explicit. It had been burned into me, not by law or by training, but by the memory of always having to ask permission for my body in my labor. I remembered nights when others had assumed. I remembered the humiliation of being expected to give without terms. I had learned the effectiveness of saying what you need and attaching it to paper. Andrew met my eyes through the dim, and he did not look ashamed of speaking plainly. He looked relieved someone else was willing to make the hard first step. "I'll do whatever you ask." That phrase, so easy and dangerous, doesn't carry the weight people think. It can be an open door or a trap. I wanted neither. I wanted to act out of care and keep my dignity intact. I wanted Ronnie to eat. "Okay," I said, "I'll try, but we write it down. We make sure it's legal. 30 nights, then we review. You pay me for private hours and for being on the roster, and it's in the guest suite only. No living in your bedroom. No—" I stopped, because saying no like that can be a trap with a wealthy man. He might assume I meant no because I needed money. I meant no because children deserve boundaries and people deserve dignity. He nodded so quickly I could see the thought racing headlong into his posture. 30 nights, review, guest suite, whatever else you want. I could have just taken the kid and fed him through the night, finished and walked away to the dark of my own life. But there are lines you learn not to cross more than once. I always asked what I needed. A guarantee I could leave, a time frame, the right to refuse further involvement. Arbitration clause, I said, naming the legal pad in my head. Confidentiality, no penalties for walking away, and I want a pediatrician on record to supervise. All of these were scaffolding, tinny and necessary, around an act that could be judged later by other hands. If anything was going to be intimate in this house, it would be accountable. Andrew listened like someone who had been admitted into a fragile chamber. He promised to call his lawyer first thing in the morning. He promised to keep Ronnie's feeding to the nursery and to hire night nurses for backup. He promised over and over until promises stacked into a kind of pillow.
He knelt there long enough for the floorboards to memorize the shape of his knees. I fed the baby. He found the breast with the clumsy, knowing hunger of a newborn. In the dimness, I could feel a soft contract forming. My body to his survival, my terms to his family's needs. The baby settled and started to sleep. Andrew stayed in the doorway, half in shadow, watching. He was cleaned up, but not untouched. The edges of sleep and despair had brought lines to his face that wealth could not polish. When Ronnie finally slumped deeper and the breathing smoothed, Andrew walked into the room and sat on the glider beside me. For a man who ran companies and made decisions that bent economies, he was suddenly very small. He turned his hand over, and I saw the tremor in his fingers. "Thank you," he said, the words so plain they might have been inadequate, except they were not. They were real. I accept help the way you accept a bandage, because it is practical and because it keeps you from falling apart. I did not expect gratitude to be the currency I would trade in. I expected bargaining. But gratitude is as soft as a bandage and sometimes lasts longer. After that night, words moved into action. He sent me a message to meet his lawyer 3 days later. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and something citrus cleaned. The lawyer spoke in clauses and margins, using language that made power sound like a neutral instrument. I read the draft and learned again the particular coldness of legal language. Guest suite, it said, lactation services up to 30 nights, renewable by mutual agreement, confidentiality clause, arbitration by neutral third party in event of dispute, compensation schedule attached. Someone had thought it through. I struck through places the lawyer had left blank. I insisted on an explicit termination clause, allowing me to cease services without penalty, immediate payment for any unpaid hours, and an independent pediatric consult on file. I refused to sign any clause suggesting exclusivity or a penalty for working elsewhere. The lawyer's pen hovered when I asked for those. Most clients would want exclusivity, he said, not unkindly, as if clients and morality were two things regularly intertwined. I'm not most clients, I said. That was true, and it settled the room. Ronnie, who had come with him, did not argue. He had a look then that said he understood the kind of work he had to do, not just to pay, but to renounce assumptions. He made the adjustments himself in the meeting after the lawyer offered his predictable guardian of capital speeches. He told me which account the payments would go into and asked if I wanted the money to be deposited or handed to me personally. I chose the account because I wanted my own quiet proof that I was not being bought for a moment. We signed. The signature felt like a hinge. It was the first legally acknowledged boundary I had been offered in a long time.
Hannah came into my life like an affirmation. She was the night nurse Andrew had hired. Thin, practical, with a laugh that was not interested in being kind or cruel. It simply was. She had been recommended by a pediatric nurse I knew at the clinic who had a soft spot for people who worked with their hands. Hannah's hands were steady. She had been in childcare for a decade and knew immediately how to position Ronnie to avoid reflux, how to coax a sleepy jaw to latch. She introduced herself by taking a syringe of expressed milk and labeling it with a firm medical circle around the date and the name. Numbers keep us honest, she told me. The house rearranged itself in the way big homes do when new rhythms arrived. Staff shifts were adjusted. The head housekeeper left an extra basket of linen in the nursery closet, labeled Kelvin. The gardener moved his rounds to afternoons to avoid waking Ronnie. There were whispered speculations, small footnotes of gossip that made the rounds like tiny mean confessions. Gossip, I had learned, was a way for people to keep from looking at their own fragility. The staff, who had known me as the maid with steady hands and polite eyes, now spoke my name with a different inflection. The house was small and prone to rumor, and the rumor took the shape of questions. Why would a man of Andrew's position kneel? Why would he ask someone like me? I heard it not as paranoia, but as a fact I had to manage. Andrew dealt with those things the way he dealt with company PR, directly, with a steadiness that sometimes felt like armor. When his mother made her first call, it was thinly veiled as concern. "Are you certain this is the best for Ronnie's social standing?" she asked, venom wrapped in silk. "People will talk." She never used my name in that first conversation. People like her liked to sanitize other people into categories that were easy to judge. Andrew did not argue in phrases. He argued in actions. He called the pediatrician into the house for a private consult. He arranged for donor milk to be on standby. He brought in a lactation consultant and paid for an equipment rental that could pump and store more efficiently. He also reminded his mother that her grandson needed him to be nourished, not protected from rumor. "This isn't about optics," he said once, voice cool. "It's about helping Ronnie." Those are small victories until they are not. Supply is a strange thing, a biological trick that sometimes cares more for the past than you do. For me, it mattered, not only because it kept a child alive, but because the act of feeding had become a way to reclaim something stolen by grief. When Lily died, parts of me had closed. The ability to feed again was a bridge back to tenderness that felt sacred and raw. To have that used solely as a balm by someone else, that was a different wound. At first, the rhythm was manageable. Nights were divided into shifts like legal documents. Hannah on from 11 to 3, me from 3 to 7, backup nurse in case the schedule broke. Feeding times were spaced. I logged volumes and temperatures in those tiny hospital notebooks doctors love. During the daylight hours, I lived in the guest suite, quiet, pale, with a small kitchen and a stack of towels folded like patient hands. I learned the ebb of the house, the way Andrew padded down in the mornings, the way his suit coats hung with patient gravity in the closet,
the quiet of the library where he retreated with finance papers like a priest with sacred texts. We had conversations that were practical and then not. Andrew learned to change diapers the way someone learns to read a novel, tentatively, then with growing fluency. He asked questions with the sort of humility I had not expected. Is there anything I'm doing that makes him cry more? He watched me when I explained reflux positions and the angle for feeding to help digestion. Sometimes he would take the tiny spoonful of donor milk the nurse offered and feed the baby like a man learning how to be gentle in a room that had not been designed for him. We had rules. Doorways were sacred places where consent was renewed in micrometers. If Ronnie was in the nursery, intimacy was a concept rather than a practice. We agreed that no sexual intimacy would ever occur within earshot or eyesight of the child. If we wanted to be intimate, it would be scheduled with a babysitter and with both of us consenting in clear terms before and during the act. That sounds over-legal. It felt humane. It felt like scaffolding for trust. There were small, tender things that could not be filed into a contract. There was a morning when Andrew, who had been learning to hold a baby in the way men hold fragile objects, careful, hesitant, sat on the edge of the guest suite's small sofa and told me about Samuel. He did not ask for sympathy, only for the permission to speak the name aloud without the air in the room tipping over. We used to watch the rain together, he said. He counted the seconds between each drop and wrote them down like confessions. The way he said it made my breath catch because I knew that sound. Grief has its own language, and sometimes it rhymes across different lives. I thought of Lily and the way she used to press her small fingers into my palm like a promise. We shared small rituals. I would sometimes leave the nursery with a dish of something steaming to his desk because food has a way of making people less sharp. He learned to notice my hands, the small calluses at the crook of my thumb, the way my nails were chewed when I was anxious. We built a vocabulary of gentleness, the sort you invent when two people spend more time with a child than alone. Consent was repeated. When he came to the nursery, he asked before he touched Ronnie, and he asked before he reached for me.
He learned how to say the words in the same practical cadence he used to ask a staffer to move an appointment. "Is this okay?" he would say, and I would answer. Sometimes I said no. Sometimes I asked for time. Each no was accepted and folded into the routines without drama. That's not to say it was always smooth. Power is sticky. There were mornings when I woke with the memory of his hand on the small of my back and wondered whether that had been permission or assumption. Those mornings we would talk. He would listen. He would apologize in ways that were concrete. He would adjust the clause in our agreement, call the lawyer, pay a little more for a night nurse. He understood, I think, that money could buy logistics, but not dignity. He chose dignity. The household gossip, however, ate away at the edges. At a Sunday lunch meant for the staff, conversations that were usually about menu changes or cut flowers bent toward speculation. The housekeepers whispered about my movements in the linen room. The groundskeeper asked Hannah, in what he thought was a casual way, how long I'd been with the family. "Knew him when?" he asked, implying a ledger of debts. Hannah, who knew better than to entertain curiosity that had teeth, snuffed it out with a look so direct it could have been a strike. But the seed had been planted. When Andrew's mother came to the house later that week in an effort that smelled of a woman practicing pity as performance, she arranged her sentences like a moralist. "There are appearances to consider," she said, as if appearances were currency in a world that already bought everything else. The first time I felt the thing that would eventually become more than rumor was when one of the staff called me into the laundry room to hand me a folded towel and then, at the last second, pressed something small into my palm.
a crumpled flyer from a gossip column, the headline cruel and sloppy. It is strange how small gestures can feel like being dredged. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket like you tuck a stone into a shoe that you will need to remove later. Then the supply wavered. I had nights where my milk came in heavy, warm as a tide, and others where it trickled like a drought. I charted every ounce like a spy tracking enemy movements. Hannah taught me new positions. The lactation consultant left me with an arsenal of pumps and herbs that might have helped if anxiety were a simple biological switch. The pediatrician was cautious and clinical. "If weight drops again," he said once, "we will need to consider supplemental donor milk or a brief NG tube until feeding is established." He said it like a man reading a report. I felt it like a sentence.
The first dip in Ronnie's percentile came after a week where the house had been full of events. Some charity dinner Andrew had hosted, the cleaning staff's schedule messed up because of a plumber, the gardener's absence, my own nerves frayed by an unexpected visit from my sister who needed a place to stay for a night. It was a series of small disturbances adding up. The baby's feedings were inconsistent. One afternoon, the pediatrician called and asked to see our logs. When Hannah handed over the notebook, the numbers were a history of starts and stops. I read the pages and felt the familiar prickle in my jaw, the old shame of not being enough for someone I loved. I noticed the way Andrew began to stand closer in rooms but not touch, the way his mother's conversations grew more pointed, and how the staff's whispers turned into looks. I felt myself bristling with a pride I used as armor. To be useful had been a balm, but usefulness can also become a ledger in which losses are measured against debts. I began to wonder if I was being kept for convenience, if my labor was becoming a neat answer to an inconvenient problem rather than a mutual arrangement. Those thoughts are dangerous in a house of money, because money has ways of answering questions by shifting responsibilities into different accounts. We had, up to that point, dealt with tensions by writing them down and paying someone to oversee them. Andrew hired additional lactation support during the day and arranged for donor milk to be on a short standby. He made calls I could not have made, used his access to move paperwork through channels I'd never see. But there are things money cannot fix. The way a person's gaze lingers on you when they think you belong to a house rather than a life. The way absence sits in the empty corner of your guest suite like a tenant. The night I left, the house was quiet in the way a thing holds its breath before a sigh. Ronnie had slept for the first portion of my shift, and then he had woken a little feverish, sniffly, taking the breast with difficulty. I had tried everything the lactation consultant had taught me. I had warmed the milk, changed positions, given a small paste bottle. He would latch and then unlatch, as if deciding every time whether the world deserved trust. The pediatrician's warning echoed in my skull with the weight of a verdict. Andrew was away at a late meeting. His phone was on the table in the sitting room, a soft blue light in the dark. I felt the old pressure in my chest, the pressure that had once made me hit the pavement with grief when Lily left me, and later made me agree to things hurriedly to keep my life from splintering. I told myself I would stay, that I could do one more night. I sat with Ronnie and watched his small hands curl around my fingers, and felt the ache of being needed so absolutely that it could crush you. At 3:30 in the morning, the house made a small noise, an almost imperceptible adjustment. A staffer moving in the next corridor, the settling of heated pipes. I packed a small bag as if preparing for a long walk. I did not plan to stay gone forever. I planned to test something, whether the promises on paper matched their use in practice. I put in a couple of shirts, my toothbrush, the small envelope that held Lily's photograph. Grief travels with you, and for me, grief had learned domestic routines. I left a note in the nursery log. I'm stepping out tonight. If weight dips,
Call consultant. My hand did not shake when I wrote it. It was the kind of action that belonged to someone who had made a habit of insisting on rights. Then I shut the guest suite door behind me and took the steps 2 at a time. Outside the house, the air was a slope of cold. The night was a wide, unadorned thing, and the stars were indifferent pinpricks. The street was empty. I hailed a cab with the habitual confidence of someone who has always saved a little money for emergencies. At the motel, the room smelled like disinfectant and old coffee, the curtains drawn tight. I lay awake with the radio murmuring background news about markets that had nothing to do with me. I had left because I wanted to know if the scaffolding the lawyer had built would hold when I was not present. I had left to see if promises would turn into actions or become decorative. At 5:30, there was a soft knock at the motel door. When I opened it, there he was, Andrew, without a suit, without the gravity of the office. Just a man who had driven across the city on very little sleep to find the person he had promised to treat with respect. His hair was mussed, his eyes raw but steady. He did not look like a man who had come to claim something. He looked like a man who had come to be accountable. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, and because he was the sort of person who used answers in forms I understood, he carried a small paper folder. Inside were copies of new clauses, explicit language about staff training, a contract for a permanent night nurse, a fund for donor milk should anything happen to my supply. There was a signed letter from the pediatrician affirming he would be on call, and a statement from the lactation consultant promising follow-up. He had called Hannah and arranged for her to be on standby. "I shouldn't have left this to chance," he said. "I shouldn't have made you feel as if your choice was about convenience. I asked for help in the worst way, and I didn't make the right room for you." There was no grand eloquence in it, only a man who was trying to show up in the practical language he spoke best. I looked at the folder and then at him, and saw that this was the beginning of a choice I could make, not a forced conscription.
The house, with all its corridors and opinionated staff and his mother's disapproval, could be negotiated with if we both kept showing up to the table. That is what the lawyer's paper had been, a table. But there was more than paper to be reckoned with. There was trust to be built in the quiet warp of real days. The night was a small evidence that he would take action, but action must be steady and repeated to mean anything. I watched the way his hands held the folder, the way his voice trembled and then steadied. He had come to ask me to come back, to try again with more scaffolding. I let him in for coffee. He made it badly, but with earnest attention to how I liked it, black, too much heat, because I always burned my tongue and still drank it. We sat on the motel bed like two people who had been given the chance to start over a sentence and were not sure what the next verb should be. I did not pack up that folder and take it as final proof. Contracts can be folded and refiled. The world often eats paper unless people feed it with actions. But he had done the hard thing for him. He had used his power to make space for my dignity rather than to paper over need. He asked me to come back and to continue what we had started, under the terms I had set and with additional safeguards. "If you choose not to," he added, "I will hire full-time donor milk services and adventurous options." The sentence trailed into the shape of a man who had a hard time speaking his heart in the open. He meant to say he would keep the baby alive either way because he loved him. He meant to say he would not let me be a scapegoat for the household's convenience. I stood in the motel room while the dawn creased open the night, feeling the old temptation to be useful
override the newer lesson about self-preservation. I had already given away so much of my private life for pennies of kindness before, someone else's crisis magnified into my own livelihood. But this felt different. It felt negotiated. It felt, perhaps, like a choice. He asked quietly if I would come back for at least one more night to see the changes through. 30 nights, he said, the words shaped now like a promise rather than a demand. We'll review together. If at any point you want out, you can leave. I held the photograph of Lily in my hand and felt the tug of history. Loving cautiously is not a lesser thing. It's a survival strategy. I told him I would return, but I asked for one more thing, that he meet me, before any more nights, in the nursery with Hannah and the pediatrician and the lawyer, so we could have a transparent working session and sign the additional documents. He agreed immediately. We both knew this was not the end of anything. It was a hinge. The house would still whisper. My supply would still have its storms. His mother would still have her opinions. But whatever came next would have the shape of consent and the language of law that said, this person has rights here.
He would try, and I would watch. That is all anyone can do at the start of something. Try and watch. When we packed up to leave the motel, the light was thin and merciless and honest. Ronnie's future had been extended by a night and a folder of clauses. The rest, how to hold vulnerability without letting it become a bargaining chip, remained to be learned. I felt, as we drove back through the waking city, both the old ache and the discreet thrill of being asked to belong. It was not full belonging. It was an invitation to try. We drove back into a house that had already begun to rearrange itself for our return. The gardener had arrived early to water the front hedges. The staff moved with the curious energy of people rearranging themselves around a new center. The nursery door was shut as if to keep the rest of the house from the intimacy it held. In the hallway, a staffer gave me a look that had fitful apology in it. In the kitchen, someone had left a pot of soup cooling on a board, an offering from a house that was trying, in the only way houses sometimes know how, to make peace through food. Andrew walked beside me, not ahead. It was a small shift, and it mattered. Power is often measured by who leads and who follows. That morning, for the first time since the night I fed Ronnie, he matched his steps to mine. It was not yet trust, it was a starting act. I went into the nursery to change the baby and to report to Hannah what had happened. The room held the ordinary artifacts of parenthood, soft toys, a small mobile, walls painted the neutral of the kind that's meant to be uncontroversial. I cradled Ronnie and felt the steady animal warmth against my chest, and it occurred to me that the first part of taking care of a child is to hold the ordinary as sacred. The rest comes later. There were still decisions to be made. There would be more nights I could not sleep. There would be staff meetings and the subtle electric current of gossip. There would be my own private, unshared sorrow that would flare like a bruise when someone mentioned Lily or when I found myself humming a lullaby that once belonged to her. But for now, there was the small, ordinary truth of a child breathing on my shoulder and the outline of an agreement, legal, emotional, careful, that might let me keep doing it without losing myself entirely. And yet, even as I recorded the morning feed, logging the ounces, measuring the time between latches, the small fissure that had formed widened with each new, uncertain feeing. I could feel it like a skin irritation, an old wound reopening. The pediatrician's words lived in my mind. If weight dipped again, then the options would change. The house would produce its own logic. Donor milk, a wet nurse employed full-time, perhaps an institutional solution that would remove me from the equation entirely. I had built my life from small mercies. I had asked for terms to protect myself, but terms could be eroded by circumstance. There are moments when you have to decide whether you will be a witness to your own life or a marginal footnote in someone else's narrative. I tried to hold both positions at once, the worker who negotiated and the person who loved the child. I told myself that love had to be a choice, not an obligation written into a contract. But even choice can be complicated by the gravity of need. That afternoon, a text arrived from Andrew's mother. I read it standing by the kitchen sink, my hands wet from washing the last bottle. It was short and clinical. I hope you understand the family's view on this. There was no salutation, no warmth. I folded the towel with deliberate care and put the message aside like a stone I might have to turn over later. In the nursery, Ronnie dozed, fingers curled into a fist. I sat in the glider and watched him. His chest rose and fell like a tide. My life had rearranged into the pattern of the house's days. I had signed papers. I had made terms. I had asked for the right to walk away. Late in the afternoon, Hannah knocked and asked whether I wanted to step out for a while. She had taken to making me 2 eggs just the way I liked them, barely set, and she had an ability to read the tired in my face like a map. "Go," she said. "Take the break. I've got him. I've got the logs." I let her hold Ronnie, and I walked out into the yard, the cool air pressing against my skin like a new thought. I knew the agreements we had made were only as real as the people who upheld them. I wanted to test the truth of those words. When I returned an hour later, the nursery door was closed quietly, and the notes in the log were neat. Ronnie's weight had not changed significantly, one way or another. It was enough to keep functioning on oxygen and hope, but it was not enough to declare victory. My phone buzzed with a brief text that read, "Meeting with pediatrician tomorrow, 10 a.m. Please attend." Andrew had signed it with a small heart emoji, something casual that meant he was trying to bridge business with tenderness. I went to bed that night with the same sense I had when Lily's room became empty, the uncanny realization that life sometimes arranges itself without your permission. I had done a good thing. I had made legal scaffolding and placed it between my body and the house's power. I had been asked to hold another person's survival and had been given, in return, a stack of papers and promises. And yet, somewhere between the contractual and the intimate, there lived the soft, dangerous thing I had been trying to protect, the way a child's small hand pressed into your skin and made a map of belonging. It was that map that would make me stay, and the map that, if ignored, would have me leave. I was living on a hinge, and the house would not stop testing whether it could be kept open. The house kept testing the hinge like someone worried a door would fall off if not checked. For a while, the tests were small, a misplaced teacup, an extra key left on a counter, a passing look that suggested curiosity rather than malice. Most of the time, the scaffolding held. The added clauses, the fund for donor milk, the pediatrician's letter in the file. These were not just paper. They were a frame you could set your back against when the world started leaning. I learned to read those documents the way people read a map. They told me what roads were permitted and which turns were watched. Days stitched into weeks. We kept the 30-night review as ritual and not superstition. Hannah brought the file on the 30th evening, and we sat in the kitchen with coffee that cooled too quickly and signed the page that said we would keep talking. The first few months were a slow building of mechanical competence. Andrew learned more than how to change a diaper. He learned how to notice the things I could not say without feeling raw. He bought a small scale and kept it in a drawer beside his desk. At 4 each morning he would, without any fanfare, go to check Ronnie's weight and then text me a short line, "All soft this morning. Thank you." Those messages were tiny acts of tending.
They were not romance dressed for gossip. They were evidence that someone was counting the same small victories. The household rearranged itself permanently around routine. Meals moved earlier to avoid rushing. The laundry schedule was altered so that the nursery sheets always had time to air out before bed. Hannah took to leaving a handwritten note on the nursery whiteboard: meds, feeds, diaper times, mood notes, a nurse's poem of practicalities. She had a dry humor and a way of telling me when I had been too hard on myself. "You are not a miracle worker," she would say, and then she would lean forward and add, "but you are very good at what you do." I began to build an interior life that included things other than the child's needs. I read again, short, lithe books that did not require the slow patience lullabies had trained into me. I went to the clinic for therapy on my own, at first only because it felt like another item to tick off the list. The therapist's office smelled of lemon and file folders. I told him about Lily in pieces until the pieces made a story again. The little socks, the way she would kick in sleep like a small protest. I watched myself bring up the moments I thought were dangerous to mention, when a parent's touch had been presumed, and we unpicked them with gloves on, practical and not sentimental. The sessions were not cures, but maps. They taught me how to name what I would accept and what I would refuse. Andrew began his own list of changes. He instituted a staff training morning, paid for by an account whose number I could recite now because it represented protection rather than charity.
The trainer was a straightforward woman from a local child care advocacy group who spoke with the blunt, kindly voice of someone who had seen too many assumptions. She laid out confidentiality scenarios, boundary expectations, how to speak when one saw a line crossed. There was an arbitration addendum added to the contract. If the household staff leaked information, the fine would be payable not to the house, but into a trust for community childcare programs. It was a small theatrical flourish on Andrew's part, something grand to make a point, but it also worked. People who would have traded whispers for amusement signed their names on the dotted line and understood there was money involved if they did otherwise. But power is a muscle, and muscles keep memory. Those who had always had access to Andrew's private life sometimes returned to old habits in the complacent way of the privileged. A public holiday at the house, an afternoon tea to raise funds for a museum, was the first place where the surface tensions turned active. Andrew's mother arrived with the kind of curated disdain that had been born into her bones. She wore a coat trimmed so her wealth could speak without words. She moved through the house like someone auditing. At the table she asked, in a voice that smelled faintly of lilies and old estate rules, "Is it not troubling, darling, that the press might misinterpret our family's arrangements? People like to make stories from nothing." He did not answer her in the petty key our family histories had taught so well. He said plainly, "Ronnie needs feeding. We are ensuring every option is supported by professionals. Kelvin has rights in this household as a contracted caregiver and as a person. That ends the conversation." There was a pause after that. It was not dramatic. No one called for silence in the way movies build a moment, but something shifted. Andrew's mother, for all her wealth, was not used to being told her concerns were, in short, irrelevant. She pursed her lips and spent the rest of the afternoon supplying platitudes about society that worn like armor. Later she called him and told him with a woman's small savagery that his choices would be the subject of polite scandal. He told her with equal plainness that if she could not meet his grandson's needs without creating harm, she would be better to leave the subject alone. He did not make a grand speech about morality. He tightened protocols, sent a brief note that the house would no longer tolerate implied ridicule of contractual staff, and asked me, privately, if any actions from his family made me uncomfortable.
He was learning to wield his power as a defender rather than an impresario. In private, we wrestled with the same ghostly question that lurked in every tender household where money could answer anything but feeling. Am I wanted or am I convenient?
I answered myself with a ledger I kept of small things. The time he brought me black coffee just as I came back from an all-night feed. The time he woke early to sit in the nursery doorway and learn how to read Ronnie's chest for signs of reflux. I also wrote down episodes where I had to insist on privacy, where I asked for more legal language because the first draft did not satisfy. I balanced gratitude with accounting because that is the only way I knew to keep my dignity. And then the supply faltered again. Not catastrophically. There had been no sudden dramatic shift, but in the kind of slow inevitability a clock gets when its battery starts to fail. There were mornings when my breasts felt heavy and taut, and others where they were as dry as a riverbed. I started to dread the hourly scale checks. Hannah was calm, technical in her response. Extra pumps, warmth, skin to skin for stimulation, supplementing with donor milk when necessary. And the pediatrician adjusted schedules and asked to revisit diet and sleep patterns. The logs began to look like a patchwork, steady, messy, hopeful, and then thin. Each notch on the scale felt like a measure of worth. The house was a gentle machine during crises, a quiet team working to prevent drama. But perhaps the most dangerous storms are those that blow where attention cannot be constant. We had a week of illness. Ronnie ran a low fever, then a cough, then seemed less interested in the bottle. With every setback, the space between what everyone wanted and what biology allowed widened. The pediatrician suggested a brief NG tube as a medical bridge should weight dip lower. He said it quietly, writing orders like someone preparing in case of an emergency. He also said, more compassionately, that donor milk could be matched and brought in swiftly if needed. He spoke like a man balancing hope and precaution. I thought of Lily in the fierce, raw way grief sometimes intrudes, an image that is not a single thing, but a collage, hospital lights, a small hand, the sudden hush of everything. To feed Ronnie felt like repairing a window with a hand still raw from the old glass. A part of me flinched at the idea of being erased, of being one more replaceable option in a household that had money enough to buy any solution. Another part argued fiercely for practicality. We were not in a place for theatrical stands. We were in a place for tiny survival acts. I chose in those moments to be pragmatic and to keep watching my own boundaries. We added a donor milk protocol to the agreement. The donor milk was purchased through a certified bank. There were testing protocols, warming instructions, and a separate log. The clause said explicitly that donor milk was a supplement, not a replacement, without my informed consent. Papers were adjusted and signed. The pediatrician wrote a brief addendum confirming that all donor supplies would be medically screened.
Those were the bureaucratic things that sometimes saved relationships, legal language as a kind of love letter to agency. But the gossip picked at the sore places. A local columnist had an inside source in the catering staff who liked to fill idle afternoons with the thrill of scandal. It started as a blip, an allusion to unusual arrangements at the house, and then took on its own life online. The story framed me as an instrument rather than a person, a hired hand with an implied meaning meant to titillate. I felt something cold and animal in myself at that moment, a rush to shrink or to burn the thing down. I did neither. I wrote a brief statement with Andrew and had his PR team issue a clear, factual note.
Ronnie was under pediatric care, and Kelvin was a contracted caregiver with full rights and protections. Andrew's response might have looked like damage control to an onlooker. To me, it read like refusal. He refused to let my personhood be reduced to a headline. Still, the strain of being watched and the biological unpredictability of supply and baby moods wore on me. There was one night late into winter when the house hummed with the ache of too many small things misaligned. The staff were competent, the donor milk stood at the ready in cold storage, the logs were neat, but Ronnie's feeds were fracturing. I had an unresolved argument in my head. Was I staying because I loved the child or because I needed this job? Had I begun to cross a line where my grief had been commodified into meaning for someone else? It is slow erosion when a person's reasons become indistinguishable from obligations. I left again, but this time my departure felt less like a test and more like a boundary being enforced. I packed the photograph of Lily into the inside pocket of my jacket and walked to the cemetery before I went anywhere else. The snow had not yet arrived. The grass was stubborn and brown. I stood at the headstone with my palms cold and unspeaking. I told her, out loud, the practical things I did not say under the fluorescent lights of the nursery, that I was tired, that sometimes being useful felt like being erased, and that I needed to see how words became action without my presence being the only proof. Saying it to her did not make the problem go away, but it made my intention real. I walked the paths a little while longer, and then went to a friend's apartment where I would not be tempted to use problems as bargaining chips. Andrew called first and then texted. At first his messages were correctly formal, asked if I was safe, if I wanted the nurse to check in. Then, increasingly, they were small details, a photo of Ronnie waking up and stretching, a short recording of the baby's laugh, which sounded like a small thing, but felt like a rope thrown rather than a trap. I did not go back immediately. I had left to see whether promises could hold without my presence to turn them into ritual. But after 48 hours, Andrew came to my friend's building with a bouquet that smelled like rain and an expression I recognized, the face of a man who had learned how to be accountable. He carried another folder in his hand. He sat on the small couch without ceremony. "I've added more," he said plainly. The folder contained clauses, yes, a defined fund for donor milk, a signed agreement with the lactation consultants for ongoing visits, the name of a second night nurse contracted for immediate backup. But underneath the paper was a different thing. He had arranged for me to have paid leave if I needed time for medical appointments or to visit places that mattered to me. He had arranged for therapy sessions at an agreed schedule, counseling not just for us individually, but household mediation for the staff so that gossip could be addressed and missteps corrected. He had also taken a step that mattered more than legalese. He had called his mother and told her, in a voice I had not heard before, that he would not tolerate her undermining the people who helped his son. I saw in his face the fatigue of someone who had finally decided to make his power useful in the way it could be least harmful. I did not come back that evening. I came back when the house had already begun the work of being less fragile. Hannah had an extra folder waiting with notes from the lactation consultant. The pediatrician came by twice that week and stayed long enough to make a plan that did not treat me as the only option. Andrew sat in on sessions and asked clinical questions not to advertise his involvement, but to be useful. He sat at the foot of the nursery's glider and learned to read the way the child's cheeks moved when he was uncomfortable. He began to tell me stories of Samuel, not as a talisman, but as a person who had existed and left a shape in someone else's life. We started attending therapy together after I insisted. The sessions were not dramatic confessions, they were practical and sometimes boring in the best possible way. They taught us vocabulary, how to ask for help, how to set a boundary, how to apologize without strings. We practiced small scripts. When you stand in the doorway and don't touch me, that is comforting. When you question my work in front of staff, I feel minimized. The therapist would ask what would make each of us feel safer, and then translate that into something we could try the next week. It was the sort of slow, patient labor that builds trust by chores rather than declarations. Intimacy came not all at once, but by micro-choices. We did not have some sudden cinematic consummation. We had conversations at the doorway, a hand brushed in the hall and asked, "Is this okay?" followed by a clear yes.
One night, months in, we arranged a sitter, took the time to make sure Ronnie was asleep with Hannah in the nurse's room, and then returned to the guest suite, where we had agreed previously nothing sexual would occur in the child's hearing. I remember sitting across from him on the small sofa, the lamp a safe, soft pool of light. He looked at me the way a man looks at someone he is learning to trust with the architecture of his life, curious, cautious, and as if he wanted permission to proceed every second. I told him what I needed, and he repeated it aloud back to me, as if to make sure he would remember. "I will not touch you without asking. If at any moment you want to stop, say stop, and it will stop." He meant it, and I believed him. What followed was not the sort of thing one writes about to satisfy gossip columns. It was the private thing of two adults who had learned to put safety before impulse. Months later, on a morning where the rain came like a promise, Ronnie's weight climbed steadily along percentile lines that made the pediatrician smile a little too wide. The donor milk fund had been used maybe twice when my supply flagged. Otherwise, a coordinated team had made sure feeds were regular and adequate. The house had set up systems that did not collapse when I was not present. I had signed off on a schedule for periodic reviews with the lawyer, 30 nights, then 90, then 6 months, each time followed by a meeting and a note in the file. The paperwork had become ritual, but not the only ritual. There were also nights where we shared silence in the nursery until the baby settled. And there were days where Andrew and I argued about something petty and then made dinner together and got bored by each other in a comfortable way. The staff had, over time, become less cliquish about the changes. They had new ways to speak about boundaries. Hannah was appointed as an unofficial ombudsperson. Staff were told directly that any breach of confidentiality would be treated as cause for termination and potential legal consequence. There were consequences and there were reparation processes. It was not perfect and people still whispered, but when they did, the house had mechanisms to address it quickly and without spectacle. My grief did not recede. It bent into new shapes. When I visited Lily's graveside, months into Ronnie's steady recovery, I did not go as penitent nor triumphant. I went as someone who had added another thing to their life and wanted to make space for the old. I told Lily, as I often did, about the small domestic miracles, a newly learned diapering technique, a silly face that made Ronnie spit milk across the nursery rug, how rain sounded different in this house, and then I simply sat and let the past and present be neighbors. Grief to me is less a wound than a companion. You do not always invite it to the table, but you do not pretend it does not exist. The ability to hold both sorrow and small joy is, I think, what keeps me from becoming someone else's ledger. The larger pressures did not disappear. Andrew's mother remained a figure at the edges, visiting sometimes with a politeness that was an economy of words. She made small, clipped observations at social functions and then left.
Her influence lingered in polite invitations that arrived and then quietly canceled when press interest flared. But these were small tempests rather than hurricanes. Andrew began to hold the line with a clarity that surprised even me. He made a speech at a charity event once where he acknowledged the household staff as professionals and spoke in a way that refused to reduce care to spectacle. It was a small public rebuke of a culture that buys care and then polices it. I watched him speak and felt something like relief, as if the house had finally learned to protect what matters rather than merely present it. There were moments of awkwardness, too. Public dinners where comments were misread, an article with a headline that made my stomach twist for a week, a staff member who missent a message that had not intended the household's private matters for gossip. But in each case, the response was consistent. We convened, we addressed harms, and the house tried to make reorderings that protected my agency. It was not easy. Nothing that is honest and practical is easy, especially when money can sometimes be wielded as hope rather than accountability. By the time the first year since that 2 a.m. night rounded to an anniversary, Ronnie was a baby who laughed like a small bell and slept easier. He recognized my voice among others. He tracked my steps when I entered the nursery. There were mornings when I would sit in the glider and watch his chest rise, the softest evidence of persistence. Sometimes Andrew would be there, leaning in with the newspaper abandoned, and we would exchange a look that was not quite affection and not quite business, a new language that blended the two. He had begun to let me take the lead on small decisions about Ronnie's routine, and always asked for my opinion before making changes. That invitation was fragile and sometimes undone, but it had started. One late spring morning, the sky thin with light, Andrew sat on the nursery rug with a small wooden toy and the baby between us. The house was quiet. Hannah had the afternoon off, and the staff's footsteps felt distant. He looked at me with a seriousness that was different from the other serious things I had seen him do at work. There was no lawyer's folder in hand, no clause to sign, only two adults in the soft, damp light of a room that had seen more small triumphs and setbacks than most places do in a lifetime. "I've been thinking," he said. It was not an unusual sentence. He was always thinking, as if his mind liked to keep lists. "About what try looks like. I don't mean the contract. I mean us."
Not in a romantic speech. "Say the words you need to say," I told him, because I had learned to prefer the literal. He inhaled. "I'd like us to try building a life together, if you want that. I'll work on power. I'll keep the safeguards. I'll continue therapy, and I'll make whatever legal changes we need. I won't let my mother dictate who you are in this house." His hands, which had once moved like someone used to commanding rooms, were now oddly tentative. He seemed to be testing the question on the nearest surface to see if it would hold. "Try?" I echoed, tasting the word as if it were an ingredient. "What does that mean for you?" "It means choosing you again and again until choosing you becomes habitual," he said. "It means turning legal language into something that governs how we care for each other. It means public things, clarifying the household's protections, and private things, checking in the way we do and not assuming. It means if at any point you say you are uncomfortable, I do not negotiate your discomfort. I act." His voice was steady, but raw in the places where hope and fear touch. I thought of Lily, and the small, stubborn way loss made me cautious. Love had always felt treacherous to offer, without knowing if the other person would guard what you gave them. I also thought of Ronnie's small fist closing around my thumb, a grasp so absolute it had become a kind of compass. I thought of the contracts and the nights and the months of practice learning to ask for what I needed. "I will not be a footnote," I said.
It was a simple line, something I had said before to myself. I want something that is not based on me giving my body as a solution to a problem that could be solved another way. I want an ongoing agreement that centers my agency. I want therapy as part of the package, review periods that we both honor, and real mechanisms for staff accountability. And, I took a breath, the kind that happens when you add an extra condition, one that matters. I want to be asked each time, consent, not assumption. He smiled then, small and weary and grateful. Yes, you'll always be asked, he promised. We wrote it into the agreement the next week, a clause about ongoing consent and a procedural chart for how to handle intimacy in the presence of the child, set times, explicit permissions, and agreed methods for withdrawal at any moment. There were objections from a counsel who thought such specificity was unnecessary. Andrew insisted. He used the language of the company boardroom, metrics, accountability, compliance to make the point. If contracts could reshape corporate culture, perhaps they could reshape private life as well. The lawyer, now a familiar figure who had learned humility in the face of a human problem, drew up the addendum and told us plainly that he had seen fewer arrangements that were as carefully considered as ours. You two have done something practical here, he said. This is sensible.
I accepted his offer to try, but on conditions that were my terms. I did not sign myself into permanence. I signed into an agreement of ongoing review with third-party mediation on the roster and a fund for my private leave. I retained the right to walk away at any review with immediate payment and no penalty. I wanted protections that could be enforced without a spectacle. That was the language that felt like dignity to me. Months folded into years in the soft, inexorable way a domestic life accumulates memory. Ronnie grew into a baby who rolled for the toy that belonged to Andrew more often than mine, who preferred the sing-song of his nanny and the untidy face I made when I wanted to make him laugh. We marked small firsts and occasional setbacks, first tooth, first fever, first time he picked up a pebble and put it to his mouth in solemn examination. I met other parents at the park and watched how the world saw us, a man with money, a man with a history, a child who carried both of them like a crest on a small chest. The world would always have its angles on our arrangement. What mattered was we had learned to answer those angles with steadiness rather than flash. There were moments when grief rose like a tide and made everything salt. Andrew knew when I went quiet and learned not to break the silence with questions that felt like demands. He learned, above all, not to scapegoat my sorrow into problems he could fix with his checkbook. That learning mattered more than any donation he made to any charity. It was the daily grind of accountability, staying in appointments, listening when I voiced discomfort, changing a clause when it failed, that proved love as a practice rather than a headline. One evening, not long after Ronnie's first birthday, we sat on the nursery rug with the television on in the background. The rain had begun to fall in a sheet against the window, and the nursery lamp threw a warm blot on the floor. Ronnie had spilled mashed banana on his knees and was making a grave attempt at clapping. Andrew turned to me and took my hand in a way that was no longer new, comfortable, ordinary. "What if we try for something more formal?" he said, soft, the way one suggests a walk in good weather. His words were neither grand nor small. They sat between us like a book both of us had been reading in parts. I thought for a moment of permanence and how our agreements had made me less terrified of it. "What does that look like?" I asked, because I wanted to test the shape of his thought. "Not the house deciding for us," he said, "not the world reading our lives and deciding what they mean, just us openly. I don't want to make promises you can't hold to, but I want to ask you to choose to try.
We'll still have the reviews, still have the therapy, still have the clauses, but—" He stopped and smiled with the sort of half-embarrassed affection that had become familiar. "I'd like to continue building a life with you, if you want that."
I had learned to give careful answers. I considered the terms, like someone who had learned how to negotiate with grief. I wanted a life that was forthright and not theatrical. I wanted to be asked. I wanted our mutual attempts to be recorded in doable actions, not declarations. "I will try," I said. I put conditions, ongoing reviews, therapy, the same legal safeguards, continued staff accountability. He agreed readily, and then added one more thing I had not expected. "And when you want more, ask. I will ask you to stay, but I will never ask you to sacrifice yourself for my peace." We did not have a ceremony. We signed nothing in a great room, no society paper asked for photographs. We held a small dinner with Hannah and the lawyer and the pediatrician as witnesses of a sort, people who had been present in the small technical ways that had kept Ronnie alive and us intact. It felt right that those who had been most practical would be with us. If love is a story, ours had become more character than plot, not dramatic arcs, but consistent, sometimes quiet commitments. The house continued to test us, as houses do. There were still days when I felt the old ache, and there were still moments when Andrew would misstep and I would remind him to ask, and he would, apologetically, adjust. Those corrections were not always graceful. They were sometimes ugly and mundane. Emails reworded, staff reprimanded, therapy sessions that ended with both of us tired and honest. That honesty was the point. We had not managed to create a paradise. We had created a practice. On one ordinary morning, when the rain made the nursery smell like wet earth and the baby slept with his mouth open and adorable in the way babies do, Andrew reached across the small space between us and placed his hand on my knee. His palm was warm, and he whispered, "Do you want to keep trying, beyond this, as a life?" The sentence was simple. It was also an offer to be judged by continuity rather than speech. I thought of Lily and how grief had taught me how to guard tenderness as if it were an instrument that could be broken if handled carelessly. I thought of Ronnie's laugh, the way he had learned to find joy as if it were a muscle. I thought of Hannah's steady hands and the pediatrician's quiet competence and the lawyer's new softness in the face of things that mattered more than power. "Yes," I said, "but on the terms we know, ongoing consent, therapy, the freedom to leave if the terms are not honored." He nodded, and in his nod I saw a man I had watched rebuild himself from private loss into public responsibility. He had been an alpha in business, decisive, commanding. He had learned to be an alpha in a different way, one who used resources to protect rather than to take. That, perhaps, was the truth the title had promised to reveal in a single line at 2 a.m.
An alpha who discovered the truth not of a person's identity in a sensationalist way, but of another person's humanity when faced with need. He had bent to his son and to me, and had found in the fragile hours what it meant to be both powerful and gentle. We exhaled together, and then turned our attention to the small domestic detail of the morning. Someone needed a diaper change. The coffee needed freshening. There was a meeting in the afternoon Andrew could not miss. Life resumed its ordinary occupations, and in that resuming I found something like defiant joy. The end of the story, if there is an end, is that life continues. built of many small agreements rather than theatrical pronouncements. There is no tidy cure here. There is no erasure of what we lost. Lily's absence is a permanent room in my house of memory. Samuel's absence is the same for Andrew. Those rooms are not closed. They are visited, mourned, and sometimes furnished with small acts of acknowledgement, a name spoken aloud, a day kept quiet. Grief is part of the architecture of our lives, and it does not need to be excised to make room for new attachments. It coexists with tenderness and with the messy work of daily care. If this quiet scene hooked you and you like stories that live in small gestures and slow changes, consider subscribing for more character-driven moments. We will return to the nursery, and I will tell you more about the ways we keep choosing. The house, in its steady way, continues its work. Ronnie will outgrow the nursery and insist on a different comforts than a glider. He will throw his cereal, he will grow teeth, he will get into scrapes that require a call to the pediatrician and a lecture about the importance of helmets. Hannah will take pride in a job well done and ask for the occasional day off in exchange. Andrew will continue to go to work and sometimes forget to call, and then remember, and then send a slightly panicked message asking if I am okay. I will go to Lily's grave sometimes and tell her things I cannot explain to anyone else. I will keep an eye on the ledger of my own life and make sure no one confuses my usefulness for an erasure of my right to say no. The final scene is not a grand pronouncement, but a small domestic picture. Rain light on the nursery window, the baby burbling in the crook of my arm, Andrew's hand steady on my knee like a careful punctuation. The agreement between us is not a promise of forever. It is a promise to continue choosing the next right thing. That is enough for now. It is honest, and it is the only foundation I know that could support any kind of lasting belonging. What moment in this story landed for you? Share it below. If you'd like more quiet, tender stories with slow-blooming trust, stay with us.